Now we're going to hear from Ted Donner of Donner and Company Law Office and the Honorable Retired Judge Ron Suter, who are going to present our next session, which is Serving as a Mediator, Memorializing Agreements and Ethical Considerations of a Mediator. Thank you.
Greetings. Judge Suter, are you with us yet?
I am. Thank you.
I want to make sure that everybody knows who you are. I suspect that 90% of this crowd consists of people that have been before you or have mediated with you before, but if they don't, I think people should know that we have in you, and I know you're not expecting me to say this, we have somebody that's been a really great part of DuPage County for a long time. And I'm for one very grateful you're here today. Judge Suter, for those of you that don't know, is not just a great guitar player who played with our Judges Night Band off and on for many years, and I hope still does, but is also someone who served as the presiding judge of our law division. And most recently, when he joined ADR Systems, when COVID first started, Judge Suter was right there working with ADR Systems to get things established so that those of us who are litigators could keep making a living. Mediating cases through Zoom was, in this county at least, pretty much initiated by these folks. And I think, like this program, Judge Suter's help in getting things going in this county is something we should all be grateful for. So thank you, Judge. I just wanted to make that tip of the hat real quick before we get started. I'll turn things over to you. Thank
you, Ted. I really appreciate that. And I knew there was a reason that I always enjoyed working with you. But Ted and I have worked together before in presenting CLE programs. My favorite, a couple of times we talked about jury trial selection, which of course is one of Ted's areas of expertise. I believe we just recently published an updated version of one of your books on the subject, if I'm not mistaken. So congrats to you as well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So what we're going to talk about today, we have quite a bit of ground to cover. And I kind of like to do it in this format where we kind of play off of each other. So we're going to be hopefully not talking over each other very much, but at least going back and forth. And also encourage any questions during the presentation. So if you use the Q&A to get the questions, we'll take a look. And if we can answer some questions as we go along, we will. And of course, if we don't know the answers, we'll just ignore your questions. Just kidding. Look, we're going to talk about mediation. That's what I've been doing since I retired from the bench at the end of 2018. And I've learned a tremendous amount about it. I feel pretty comfortable in the role of a mediator. So hopefully we can give you some helpful guidance in doing this because it is different. I found out it's much different being a mediator than it was being a pretrial judge, for example. And being a judge, period. So as we put up at the top of our discussion here, mediation is one form of alternative dispute resolution. And there are alternative dispute resolution forms that have been around for centuries. I mean, I hate to bring up trial by battle, but I think that was maybe one of the original forms of alternative dispute resolution many, many years ago. But we have many others now that are currently in use as well. The one that I'm most familiar with is arbitration. I do that with some frequency for ADR systems. And there are others. Ted, do you care to mention any other forms at this point? We don't want to dwell on it, I know.
What other forms of ADR there are?
Yes.
There's a lot of hybrid forms. There's obviously arbitration is a form of ADR, as you mentioned. There's also med-arb, which is a process by which the mediation goes right into an arbitration. People use shadow juries or mock juries to decide cases. There's high-low settlement methodologies by which people can resolve part of the case and not all of it. There's a whole host of, as creative as you want to be, but mediation is certainly the central way that people resolve disputes short of court.
Right. So as we put up here on the slide, it is a process, and which requires a trained neutral. And that's the goal of these sessions that are being sponsored by the court and by the DuPage County Bar Association, is to give some training to folks, which I think is a wonderful thing, not only just the training, but that a number of attorneys are going to be willing to step up to the plate and act as mediators in these very important disputes. I mean, Dave Clark covered it, I think, quite well in his comments, how important this can be. And no one knows if the floodgates are going to break open, but I think it's pretty much suspected that they will. And so I give credit to DuPage, to Judge McCluskey and Judge Belford, Judge Popejoy especially for working with these guys to get this program going. I think it's going to be very helpful. And the Bar Association jumped right on board, so as usual. Mediation is non-adversarial, and obviously the goal is to help the parties reach an agreement. And mediation allows for creativity in the process. It is voluntary, although my understanding in this program, people it may become mandatory. But even in a mandatory mediation in this format, no one can force a settlement onto either a landlord or a tenant. So, I mean, it's a process in which the neutral is a neutral, just that. We're going to talk about that again in a moment. And also, I think important is that it's a confidential process. Todd?
I would add, only when you talk about this program, I think it's important to make sure everybody understands the mediation training you're getting here is to give you a thumbnail understanding of how this stuff works. You can take a 40-hour program, excuse me, through things like Northwestern or the Center for Conflict Resolution, which would qualify you for mediating other disputes on the second floor in Cook County and other avenues. But this program will help you just specifically with the smaller universe of eviction cases. And in that context, I think it's important for all of us, what I'm getting out of this and what I got out of the Northwestern program is a better understanding of how to litigate. Knowing what goes on in a mediator's head is, I think, good for all of us to study. So I hope whether you actually do the volunteering with us or if there's stipends there may be, that you get something out of this program. And certainly if you get questions along the way, hit that Q&A button. I am watching it like I have been since we started. I'm going to turn the slide, Judge.
Yes.
And then whoa, yeah, there we go. I forgot about this one.
Okay. So Ted, why don't you kick us off on this one?
This is actually a slide that we got from Kimberly Verist. It's to show you all, just to take a look at the differences there are between what you get out of the mediation process versus what you would get stuck with in the litigation process. Mediation is cooperative instead of adversarial. It's less expensive. You can get things done quicker. It's confidential instead of having things out on the public record, and it helps heal relationships more than a judgment in favor of one party or the other could. It is also, because it is steeped in the negotiation process, at least intended to provide a shot at win-win solutions. You know, this idea that maybe both sides can get something that they need out of the process, rather than somebody win, somebody lose, as happens in a trial. That's the basic reason for this slide. Judge, is there anything you want to add on it, or is it?
Let's move on. I think that covers it.
And this is the related idea that, you know, mediation is steeped in basic negotiation, where the two parties are working together and they are looking to find ways to get to their interests rather than their position. Your Honor, when I've mediated a case with you, and I have to say that the way that you asked us all questions going back and forth in caucusing was a really effective way to get to that. I was impressed with how you did that. Can you talk about that a little bit for us?
Sure, I appreciate it. And that's a technique that is very common in most mediations, just called caucusing, where, and we'll talk about initially how the whole mediation kind of works with the opening session, but then you usually break off into kind of like breakout rooms where you'll meet with one side, you talk, you know, at that point, you'll know hopefully something about the case. And I mean, commonly in these cases, you know, there's a rent dispute, there's a possession dispute. Those are the two main elements in eviction cases. Years ago, I had the eviction call for a while, so I did it. And I think those are still the issues, although with COVID, there may be other things to talk about as well. But you just go back and forth between the parties and say, okay, tell me, you know, what do you want to talk about? I try and let the parties kind of run the mediation, which seems to work pretty well. But then you throw in some things as well as you're going along and talking with each side, and you go to the other side and say, well, this is the point of view of the landlord. This is what the landlord has to say, or this is what the tenant is looking for. And try and bring the sides together by just doing that back and forth process.
I'm going to turn to the next slide.
Yes.
So why involve a mediator? This is basically to speak to the value of mediation generally. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Well, I think, and I know we're going to talk about this probably again shortly, but the first bullet point up there, that mediators serve as neutral intermediaries whose communications are confidential. That says a lot. And neutrality is a key component, I think, to being a successful mediator. I mean, I've been listening to what people have been saying so far, and I agree with almost everything that's been said. And I agree with Dave Clark when he says that homelessness is terrible. It is terrible. It's a huge problem in this country. But as a mediator in these types of disputes, you can't forget about the landlord, and you have to make it clear. And we'll talk about opening remarks when you do a mediation, but you have to make it clear to the parties that you are truly there as a neutral. You're not there to help one side over the other. You're there to try and mediate this dispute and bring the parties together. And that is so important in any mediation.
Well said. I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Sure.
So I think that gets to one point that you were just talking about earlier. There was a difference between what you did when you were a judge and what you're doing now as a mediator. And I think it's important to point out that there's an evaluative kind of mediation, which is the process that you get from a judge, usually in a courtroom, and to some degree from a retired judge like Judge Souter, that involves a little bit of telling people where it's likely to go. Well, you're going to have trouble with this issue. You may have some resistance from the court on that if you don't get a settlement. A facilitative negotiator, on the other hand, really does, as Judge Souter's been talking about, step back a lot and try to, no balls and strikes gets called, right? You just basically listen, you try to facilitate, you try to be non-judgmental as best you can. I've put on this slide at the end, though, this idea of a hybrid facilitative evaluative, because I don't think, as a practical matter, that with the limited training that we're doing here and the limited environment we're working in, that any of us are going to be able to avoid saying to the parties, look, you might end up getting booted out of here if you don't have your rent paid, and the lease is the lease. It's not too much of a reality check for a lawyer to say, who's serving as a mediator to these parties, this is unlikely outcome, and to make those kinds of reality checks in the course of the process. You just want to remember that your goal is to not interject yourself any more than you need to, right? You want to make sure that to the extent possible, you let the parties work things out in terms of what solutions they're crafting, and that you don't tell them how it's going to be, because that's not the job of a mediator. Your job is to stay neutral as best as possible and to try to stay out of their way in that respect, just for the sake of your own credibility, if nothing else, as the process goes on. Judge?
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Ted, and I'm glad you added that last point on there about the hybrid form, because that is what I envision this program basically encompassing. And that's what a lot of private mediations that I'm involved in, that's the way it comes down. At first, very neutral, and just go back and forth and hope the parties can talk about what they need, what they want, what they're willing to compromise on. But at some point during a lot of mediations, the parties will turn, one or both will turn to the mediator and say, well, what do you think about it all? What can you help us? What, you've seen this type of thing before. So I'm assuming that a lot of the attorneys that are attending this program have been to eviction court, have handled clients, either tenants, landlords, maybe both, and have the experience to qualify. So I think it will be a hybrid process in the end.
That's partly what we're going to do in the session in 2 weeks too. Everybody should know is that section, while we're spending today, at least the rest of today, focusing on general mediation issues and general skills and programs that you should think about as you serve as a mediator. When we come back next time in a couple of weeks, in order to qualify to mediate in this program for DuPage, you're going to focus on landlord-tenant issues, some condo issues, attorney fee issues, all the kinds of things that go into the question of how this case could work out, so that you can help with that hybrid evaluative side of things. And on that, I'm going to switch to the next slide, I think, which I think is going to take us to what you were talking about earlier, Judge, what the mediator does. And I think this is from your original outline.
Yes. So I put stay positive, be confident, of course, be competent, and be neutral. Staying positive is important. Okay, people want to have, if you stay positive, that helps promote confidence in you as a mediator and people that will hopefully be listening to you. I mean, I guess, vision for what's going to occur here, and it was the same when I was involved in it. We have Prairie State, and they're wonderful, and they do a great job, although I'm not sure they'll be covering all these folks. I mean, you may have some pro se landlords or tenants. I can digress and tell you a very quick story, and I don't think that Justice Liam Brennan would mind me telling this story, but I was, I had the eviction call. Liam became appointed as a judge, an associate judge, and we always had a little reception after the ceremony. And the man came up to me and introduced himself as Liam's father. And so I introduced myself, and he said, "I know who you are. You threw me out of court once." And I'm like, "Excuse me?"
Oh.
He was a landlord, and he owned some property, and he didn't serve the 5-day notice. And he goes, "It's okay. I talked to my son, and you were right." So, okay, I digress once again. I love to tell stories, but I put patience down there is a key. And you'll see in the materials we've provided a sample mediator's opening remarks, and talk about patience when you're in the main session where you're talking to everyone. You want to let them know that patience is a key for a successful mediation, as is a willingness to compromise and be open-minded. So let's see. I also put in here not providing legal advice. A mediator may predict when it gets down to it what the outcome of the case may be, but this is not a format for giving legal advice to either side, frankly. So, Ted, anything to add?
I think the one thing I would add to that last point, Judge, is that once upon a time, the bar did a program with the courthouse because there was a question about court staff are always told they're not supposed to give legal advice. And the question becomes really, at what point do you cross that line? When are you given legal advice as opposed to just giving information? And I think that's the key, is you got to remember that giving somebody factual information, letting them know, for example, that there are disputes in court over whether process has been correctly served, to harken back to what Dave was talking about earlier, is different than saying, look, if I were you, I'd argue over whether there's process here, because as I look at this summons, it looks like it was served on somebody that wasn't qualified to take service. That's too far. But recognizing to the landlord when you're talking to them, you may have some issues with service here in a caucus, is a different thing. And I think that's okay to do. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I agree. I think you're exactly right.
So that's that. We've also got something up here about the role of the parties, because we want to emphasize the idea that, and I've said this a couple of times, this idea that in some ways you want to stay out of their way. The landlord and the tenant are both going to, like anybody in a mediation, look to the mediator to try to solve their problems. And they're going to be looking to you for guidance, and they're going to be looking to you for information. But you don't want to just walk them through, do this, do that, do the other thing, because at some point, they need to take ownership of their own settlement. They need to think these problems through. And just like the Socratic method in law school, asking them why they're thinking about a certain thing, or what is important about that to you, is a better way to find things out for everybody than to tell them, well, that shouldn't matter. The more you hold their hands, the more you are getting in the way of their settlement. So you want to be careful to let them negotiate their agreement, recognize that they need to establish a relationship, not just with each other, but with you. There's a video that I'll be giving you all the link to at the end. That's just a mediation that was filmed by another bar association on the East Coast. And the mediator starts out by pointing out to both sides, look, we have an agreement here. And I liked this. She says to them, nobody's going to interrupt each other. So landlord, if you hear something the tenant says that you don't like, write it down. And when it's your turn to talk, you can say it. But we want to make sure everybody's respectful of each other in this room. And that's, I think, a part and parcel of what you want to do in getting the parties to behave a certain way with you and establish your own rapport with them. And you want to be mindful of the idea that they may have to get through some stuff, some dirty laundry to get there with you in the course of the process. That's really all I want to say on that topic. I don't know, Judge, is there anything you want to add on it, or?
Well, I just say, I think it's important that you find out where their relationship is, okay, between landlord and tenant. There are, of course, some apartment complexes, and I recall this because someone mentioned attorneys that would come in with 75 eviction cases on the court call, all within the same apartment complex. So there's probably not much of a relationship between the landlord and tenant in those situations. I mean, they have property managers, of course, and maybe there's a relationship with a property manager. The more kind of interesting relationships, at least in my experience, were in smaller type of rental units. Like you're renting a house, you're renting in a 2-flat or a 3-flat or something like that, and you have a lot of contact with the landlord. So but yes, I agree with what you're saying there, Ted. I mean, these are things that are designed to try and reach a resolution and kind of stay out of their way and let them exert their feelings and let it come out during the mediation.
What you're saying about relationships rings true for me, Judge. The one case I had this last year during COVID was for a landlord whose tenant was renting a room from them. So they shared a refrigerator.
Right.
And that was a much different scenario than, as you say, the building was 75 units. And it lends itself to different concerns, right?
Absolutely.
Anything else you want to add on that, or should we?
I think we can move on.
Okay. Someone is asking us, we got a question just now, is working as a mediator in this program considered practicing law? I asked because I work for a corporation that prohibits practicing law unless there's express permission outside of the company. From your last slide, based on the bullet that says the mediator does not provide legal advice, it seems that I would not have a problem working in this program. Do you want to answer that?
I can kind of give you my thoughts on it. I don't know 100%, I'm not sure, but in my opinion, I don't think I would need a current license to practice law to be a mediator. And I think some non-lawyers are mediators, not with my company, but so I don't think it is the practice of law, but I mean, there's certain aspects, of course, that come close. How do you look at it, Ted?
I completely agree with you on that. And I actually know one trivial thing, but it happens to be true. In the rules that have been adopted for this program by the DuPage County Judicial Circuit, the people that are qualified to mediate either have to have a JD or they have to have been through this kind of training program and have some experience mediating. You don't have to have a JD to participate in this. So we're going to have some mediators certainly that are volunteering. I know some from the Northwestern program who are here that have not got JDs, do not practice law, and they're here to just mediate disputes. And I think that's going to be part and parcel of what people are going to sign off on when they first sit down with the mediator to sign the mediation agreement. And I think you guys do that with ADR systems, actually, don't you?
They do have a contract when mediators are engaged, yes.
It's a good document. We may steal from it a little bit.
Okay.
So I'm going to pause here to show a little bit of a video on this idea of a $20 auction. I apologize in advance if the technology doesn't work like it should, but hopefully we're going to get a video now.
For our next game, we're holding an auction. We're going to see if we can get people to spend more than 20 bucks on a $20 bill.
If you are listening to me, please mention in the chat if you're having trouble hearing for any reason.
But there's a catch. The runner-up also has to pay the amount they bid. That extra rule might not seem like much now, but we guarantee it'll come into play later. How high do you think the bidding will go? We're going to start off at $1.
In the back, number 505 is in for $1 in the purple shirt. I've got $2 right there at number 222. $2. Who wants to bid for 3? For 3, number 202. Do I have a $4 bid? I've got a $4 bid right here in the front of the room there.
Wow. Our auction's off to a great start. If it ended now, the winner would get a $20 bill for just $10. But things are just getting warmed up.
Okay, I get $11, $12 bid, $13 a bid. Do I have a $14 bid? $14 bid, number 808 right there. 505 is back with $15.
Right now, this guy owes $15 for $20, which means he's still ahead $5. But second place owes $14 and gets nothing in return. If you had bid $14, what would you do? Lose your money or keep going? This is where things get interesting.
$16 is the bid we now have here, and $575 is in for $17.
While most of the crowd is starting to realize that something's not quite right,
It was crazy out there, so I ended up bailing out.
a few intrepid people stay in.
Number 202 is in for $18. $19. Number 4 is for 4. Come on, baby. We never saw this coming. This is incredible.
Okay, now it's down to these guys. But let's take a second and think about what's about to happen. One of these guys is going to spend $20 on a $20 bill, and the other guy is going to spend 19 bucks on absolutely nothing. Will they keep playing or quit while they're ahead?
And there it is right there, a $20 bid.
This guy just bid $20 on the $20 bill. At this point, it's a no-win situation. One person is going to overpay for a $20 bill, and the other person is going to pay a whole lot of money for a whole lot of nothing. Will they keep bidding, or will they realize they can't win?
There it is right there. There's a $21 bid right now. Do I have a $22 bid at number 202? $22 the bid right there. 22 in the back of the room, number 202.
This auction just went from who's going to win the most to who's going to lose the least. At this point, they're just throwing away money.
4 is back there at $23. It's once again a 2-horse race. And 202 is back with a $24 bid. And there it is, a $25 bid right there. Will you give me 26? I know you got it there. 202. And there it is, $27. The pride is kicking in at this point. He's rolling us. And there it is, $28 is the bid right now.
The unusual rules of this auction are forcing
Oh, sorry.
these guys to make what looks like irrational choices. What would you do in this situation?
I'm going to stop the share for just a moment. Somebody asked me to provide the link to that video, and I'll put that in the chat box in just a little bit. Judges, you know, this is a game that I'd hoped we'd be able to play with this group. It's a game that I have played with my students at Loyola for 30 years. It comes out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. And like here, every single time you do this with a round of people, the bidding just keeps going. I've had students bidding 50, 60 bucks because at that moment that the narrator was talking about in this National Geographic version of it, there comes a point when you're no longer talking about who's going to win the most, but who's going to lose the least, right? And so the reason for this video, guys, is to make sure that we emphasize this one concept to people, particularly when they come in the course of these evictions. Thank you, Barb. The link is up there in the chat box, folks, from Barb Mandrell, if you need it, is to emphasize this idea that there are a lot of, this is a zero-sum game, right? For the landlord and the tenant, there's only so much money the landlord can ever get. There's only so fast he can or she can get possession. For the tenant, there's only so much they can do to avoid getting a credit rating hit or keep their monetary costs down. At some point, the process of fighting over this stuff gets to be a lot more expensive and a lot more painful than the process of settlement. And that's something that we want to make sure that everybody that comes into this program gets early on, is an understanding that this is how it can work, and to recognize that every auction can eventually become a $20 auction. If the plaintiff is the winner and the defendant is the loser, both of them have to pay those fees. Both of them have to pay those costs. Both of them have to deal with the time and aggravation that came out of this. Like in the $20 auction, both of the top two people have to pay something in. You want to add anything to that, Judge?
Well, just this, and I'm sure it'll be covered probably in the next session, when that's coming up. But during my time on the bench, when I had the eviction call, I found that the best legal advice given to landlords by their lawyers was to forgive either all or a large portion of the past due rent in exchange for a concession on having the tenant move more quickly than might ordinarily occur during the process. So that's to avoid, that's again, losing the least. I mean, I think that's an example of that.
We got a message from Raymond Sanguinetti. Thank you, Judge McCluskey. I'm hoping that's a joke because Raymond, I don't know what you're saying there. But that's where we are in the questions. This next, whoops, where'd you go? What we're talking about comes into play in something called the sunk cost fallacy, and I've got a video here that I'm gonna also send you all a link to. We are just finally caught up back on time again, though, so I'm gonna pass over that video if you don't mind. Judge, should I put back on the screen
Yes, I think
there
so.
we go. Slideshow from current slide. Okay. The sunk cost fallacy, to just briefly tell you guys what that is the idea that we have a tendency to get invested in what we did in the past, right? So like the $20 auction, people get invested in the gamble, and the more invested they are, the more they're stuck with that investment. Likewise, the analogy they give in the video is you spend $10 to go to a movie, you may be 10 minutes into it and it stinks. You don't get up and walk out because you've got your $10 invested in it. Landlords and tenants are going to be coming in very often complaining about what's gone on with them for years, how far behind everything is in rent. They need to be able to focus not so much on the pain of the past, but on what's coming up for them now and what's coming up in the future. And so when you think about sunk costs, that's one concept to remember in terms of how to deal with these landlord and tenant disputes. And Judge, that brings us to the how does mediation begin session, which is I recall from your outline originally.
Yes. So the first thing I have up there is the main session. And I would like to say this. It's my understanding that on this program, some, if not most, of the mediations will be in person, but I believe some may also be conducted by Zoom, and especially depending on what happens down the line here. I mean, hopefully we're coming out of COVID and get things, hopefully we'll be getting back to a more normal situation, but maybe not. We've learned that that's not always the case. So I will say this, mediation in my experience works just as well by Zoom, if not even better than in-person mediation. So a main session is just what it says, where everyone is together. And that's when a mediator will make his or her opening remarks. And again, there's a sample just so you can use maybe as a pattern in the materials that we provided. Then parties' opening remarks, optional. Frankly, though, usually not helpful. I don't encourage it because it's what we're talking about. Sometimes, in this relationship, there are feelings of hostility on both sides. Where's my rent? Why are you being so mean? Why didn't you fix up the apartment? All sorts of issues. So I don't encourage it, but if parties want to make opening remarks, I'll allow it. I don't stop it. So then we kind of talk about meeting separately with the mediator. We can go out into breakout rooms if you're on Zoom. I'm sure there'll be facilities there. I assume these are going to be taking place at the courthouse if it's in person, maybe not. But anyway, there'll be places where you can meet separately with the parties and any lawyers that are involved. Again, I put caucusing as optional. And again, that's just meeting separately. I find it's a good way to go, though, because it allows people to blow off steam when you're alone with one side or the other. They can tell you all the bad things about the tenant, all the bad things about the landlord, whatever it is. you don't have to pass those along when you go back and talk to the other side. You just use your common sense and good judgment.
Your Honor, would you mind talking a little bit about what you put into your opening remarks and how you fashion that for the parties when you sit them down?
Sure. I just want to, talk about the process, what we're going to be doing, the goal of the process to reach a settlement. I want to talk a little bit about myself to let them know that, hey, maybe I'm qualified to do this or why I'm qualified. That, in my case, my experience as a judge, in attorneys' cases that are going to be doing this, their experience in handling landlord-tenant cases. And again, just projecting a positive atmosphere, trying to, have a very positive personality so that people like you. You want people to like you. It makes it easier to facilitate the dispute. So, that's really what the opening's all about.
You mentioned earlier this idea of confidentiality. Is there an explanation you'd like to give to the parties about how that works?
Sure. Confidentiality, of course, is very important. And it's not, it's not going to be in a public setting like in a courtroom where everything is open to the public, everything is public. So you talk about confidentiality in a couple of different ways. I let them know that it's a confidential process, which means I'm not going to be going, to Ted Donner and saying, hey, Ted, you won't believe who I had, for my mediation. It was Jim McCluskey. Can you believe it? The guy wasn't paying his rent. It doesn't happen. You don't go as a mediator. You don't go and talk to people about cases you've been mediating, but it's also confidential in that it's not set out there in the public. So, it's kind of on two levels of confidentiality. And you may have something to add to that, Ted. And if you do, please go right ahead.
I think that covers it. I wondered, and I remember you doing it. I wanted to make sure that we talked about how you go about it. And thank you for that.
And when we, open up Zoom sessions now, confidentiality is important as well. So at the beginning, I always ask, is anyone recording the session? Because there is a recording function on Zoom, as you know, this is being recorded. And are there any other third parties present that we can't see on the screen that are listening in? The case I had today was an arbitration, but the plaintiff's husband was there and nobody had an objection to it, but he was not on the screen. So that's, in the Zoom COVID world, you need to take those steps as well.
The only thing I'd add otherwise is this references crosstalk and caucusing. And the reason it does is because the CCR Northwestern style of facilitative mediation is they try to emphasize this idea of crosstalk, of people staying at the table and talking, which in my experience as a courthouse litigator has certainly not been something that I was particularly comfortable even trying. I did see, though, that there are people that are remarkably talented at it and can somehow take the ability to talk with people together in one room and make it turn into something. I agree with you, though, Judge. There's a point where when you have this kind of hostility, that keeping them separate can be a lot safer route to take, and certainly helps them talk more freely about what's going on with them without worrying about somebody on the other side of the table jumping up and pounding their fists and saying, McCluskey's not just 4 months, he's 6 months behind, that kind of thing. So it's
right.
It's caucusing is good.
It is, but again, what this cross talking, I get it, I understand it. And you could maybe even have a kind of a hybrid session there where you have everybody together, you do the cross talking, let people talk, bring their own points up, and then you could break off into some separate meetings with people.
We have a message here. Do we want to tell the participants that what's said in mediation cannot be used in another proceeding? And that certainly is something we should point out should they have a hearing or such. And yeah, this is the Uniform Mediation Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit, speaks to that. Nothing that happens in the mediation other than a binding agreement at the end is admissible in any proceeding.
Yes. And I think in my sample opening, I may have included that as part of it. I hope I did, because that's a very good point. And you do want to let people know that. And then the other thing that I included in there, I believe, is that in the event the mediation is not successful, no one is going to go back into court and say, hey, it was McCluskey's fault. He wasn't willing to, cough up the
Right.
money for the rent. So you don't put the blame on anybody if it's an unsuccessful mediation. Good point. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Andrea. There was somebody named Andrea, couldn't tell you. So what happens during mediation? This is kind of a hybrid of some of the points that a lot of us have been talking about the last few weeks. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on these ideas. Your Honor, do you want to talk first about positions and interests?
Sure. So that's, it's not too difficult, I wouldn't imagine, in most of these cases that are going to be mediating. What are the issues? What do we agree on? Okay, so we agree that there's a written lease. We agree there's a month to month. There's no written lease. What are the parties agreeing on to begin with? And then what are the goals? What are we talking about as far as what people want? Kimberly's sending a message. That's good. Sorry, I got distracted with that. So it's just to try and, again, this process that helps the parties reach and define a settlement agreement in these types of cases.
There's a famous book, Getting to Yes, that was written by Fisher and Urey that very soon now we're going to have another video that talks about, that gets to this idea of positions and interests. But the bottom line, as Judge Souter said, is to get them talking and figure out where you are and where they're going to go from here. The ways that happens are going to vary a little bit. Sometimes you have what are called bargaining zones where you can get a sense, okay, they've got $1,000 and they're demanding 3,000. Those kinds of settlements happen along a very fixed line. In these cases, it's going to be important, I think, to think about ways in which you can, as they say, expand the pie and think about different resources that everybody can bring to bear. For example, it doesn't hurt to talk about what kinds of assurances can the tenant give the landlord about what shape or condition the property is going to be in when they move out. That's going to be an important factor that may help keep promises in line. The nice thing about these agreements is they're happening in a courthouse. So if you do get an agreement in place and somebody promises that they will move out by such and such a date and they will make sure the property's in this kind of condition, that then there will be a dismissal order that's going to take place in 6 weeks. I've done that. Judge McCluskey used to have us doing with David Clark's Ask a Lawyer program. Those of us from the DCBA could represent the landlord. Perry State would have the tenant. We'd negotiate these solutions and then come back 6 weeks later for the judge to basically enforce them. And that is one nice thing that you have here that you don't have in negotiations outside the courthouse, which is an ability to get things set up in a way that the judge can enforce. That's my only 2 cents on that, Judge. Anything else you want to add? Or
No, that sounds good.
okay. I think we're about to. So this is if you do reach an agreement, and I touched on this just a little bit by talking about the idea of judge enforcement, you're going to have to put together a written document. And Your Honor, if you wouldn't mind talking about that, I would sure appreciate it. It's something that I think needs to have a little bit of flesh on the bone because people really need to understand what makes an enforceable settlement agreement. And you as a judge certainly know a document that you can enforce and one you don't.
Sure. Well, first of all, it needs to be signed by the parties once it's done, the attorneys and the parties, if there are attorneys involved. But you just set out whatever the agreement is, if it's pertaining to back rent, if there's going to be a partial waiver or a full waiver of back rent, you want to include that. You want to include the amounts. If there's going to be a payment of past rent, is there going to be a payment plan? What is it? Be very specific. Be as specific as you can in writing up these agreements. And then once you write up the agreement, pass it around. Let everybody read it. People want to suggest changes, or that's not what we agreed to, whatever the case may be. You need to flesh that out as well. And it's the same thing if you're doing it on Zoom, which is what almost all of my mediations and arbitrations are conducted by Zoom for the last year and a half. there's a recording function, as we know, and we've mentioned before, and you say, I'm going to record the settlement agreement. And again, you have to be very specific with the terms. If there are dates when A, B, or C is going to happen, this will happen by this date. If there's a payment schedule, payments will be made. Let's see, there's a question. Are we using court-approved documents for the settlement agreements? I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Ted?
There's talk of forms. I'm not sure that they've been finalized. I don't know what, actually, there was talk of guidance maybe coming from the state Supreme Court on those things, because there will be an order. David,
Right.
got
Yeah, may I just chime in here real quickly? I did speak with the judges before we went on here, and they are amenable to written orders. So while we will have forms available, if we want to do it and try to process as many as possible by hand, there'll be blank orders, and the judges have indicated they will accept those orders.
You know what, we'll address this in part 2, Day, and we'll have all of those orders and agreement samples that our mediators will use. And we'll train you all on that on September 23rd.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One other important thing that is on this slide that's in front of us right now is setting time limits on the mediation at the beginning may be helpful, and I think most definitely is helpful. So, not to add pressure to the process, but you can set some time limitations on it. So there's a beginning, a clear beginning, and a time to end. But of course, there are exceptions in every case. If you're going strong and you're close to your reaching an agreement, and you're almost at the end of your time, you can extend it, obviously. That happens all the time in mediations. But I think it's a good idea to have some timeline with what you want to, your goal is.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I will turn to the next slide, which I think is going to be a video. Yeah, so this, like the other one, we're going to see the exercise in video instead of in person. Hopefully everybody can hear okay.
A simple parable delivers the key message in Getting to Yes. It's the story of an orange. To be precise, one orange and two people who both want it. They argue about ownership for a while and eventually decide to divide it, half each. And so they separate, feeling they achieved the fairest solution. What they
Sorry.
don't know is why the other person needed the orange. If they had, then the solution would have been quite different, because one wanted the peel to use in baking a cake and the other wanted the fruit to eat. Had they known that, they each would have gotten twice as much, and they most certainly would have got to yes a whole lot more quickly. If you haven't heard that story, maybe you didn't see it coming. That's because in negotiations, we focus on our positions, as in I want the orange, rather than the underlying interests that drive those positions, as in I want to bake an orange cake. It sounds so obvious when it's explained, yet we persist in taking positions which tend to be I win, you lose confrontations, often missing solutions that best address the interests of both sides. If we can see our way to take the interests-driven route, it's so much easier to get to yes. The journey to yes. The idea is to constantly search for mutual gains that aren't immediately identifiable. For example, suppose a city plans to double the taxes paid by a local refinery. The city's interest is in getting more money for civic development. But since it can't keep calling on the oil company to foot the bill, it needs to broaden its tax base. The oil firm, on the other hand, wants to expand, and getting a plastics plant to move close by would help with their plans. But the plastics manufacturers would almost certainly be put off by the prospect of high taxes. The shared interest is that both the city and the oil company want industrial expansion. Solutions might include a tax holiday for incoming businesses, a joint campaign to attract new investment, or a reduction in taxes for companies that expand their local activities. On the other hand, failure to identify these common interests could result in soured relationships where everyone loses. The company could slow production due to rising costs, and the city's citizens could lose jobs, creating more strain on the city's already tight resources. 3 points about shared interests are worth remembering. First, many shared interests are often concealed or never uncovered in negotiation. You have to work hard to identify them. Second, there are only opportunities if you find a way of turning them into a shared goal. And third, focusing on them can make negotiations smoother and friendlier. Even differing interests may offer opportunities. Think of that orange story we began with. The interests of the two people were quite different, but could have been dovetailed together to provide a neat solution. Recall the nursery rhyme about Jack Sprat, who could eat no fat, and his wife, who could eat no lean. Get the picture? Getting to yes is all about identifying what's really important for each party, dealing with the differences and finding common ground. It's achieved by brainstorming and trying to view issues from each other's perspectives. This process produces a range of imaginative solutions to satisfy the interests of both sides to create a true win-win solution.
Anything you want to add to that, Your Honor?
I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Good video.
Thank you. That brings us to just some quick housekeeping stuff, which is the ethical considerations you need to look out for. We have included in the materials some documents you may want to take a look at. The Association of Conflict Resolution's Ethical Standards of Practice is a model. They're not the law anywhere, but what they do provide you is some insight into some of the ways in which mediators nationwide have put together an understanding of how you should look at different things from an ethical perspective. They speak in more detail to these questions of how you stay impartial, what kinds of things you should do or not do to make sure you maintain impartiality, and some basic ideas. You're certainly not going to take payment from one side or the other. That kind of stuff is just way off limits. And so I don't think there's anything to really say about them other than just suggest everybody take a look. The Uniform Mediation Act, on the other hand, which is also in your handout materials, that speaks to the confidentiality issues, and it speaks to some of the other concerns. That is the law. And the Uniform Mediation Act is both binding on mediators statewide under the ILCS, and it's incorporated by reference in the DuPage County local rules as applicable to mediators that are working specifically in this program. It's not that long a handout, so I'd recommend you take a look at that. There's another handout on issues with confidentiality, which just came out a couple months ago, actually, from the ABA, that deals with some of the questions that come up there and is worth looking at. And finally, just to put the period on this thing, one thing that those of you that have taken the Northwestern program or the CCR program should know, there's no such thing as a mediation certificate that makes you legally qualified to mediate. Judge Souter is a lot more qualified to mediate than I am. I got my mediation certificate. I don't know if he ever did, but the man's been mediating cases for 20, 30 years, right? And so it is like paralegal certificates. It is something that is out there. People get pieces of paper, but they don't legally do anything. What does happen is courts approve programs. DuPage County approves mediators for cases generally on the second floor that have a 40-hour certificate, and it approves people for this eviction program that have the 8-hour training that we're doing here. That's a different thing than being licensed or certified. And those are just the documents. Your Honor, do you want to say things about the ethics of mediation generally?
Well, I just want to talk about something that you touched on, which was naming mediators through the court system. When I was presiding judge of the law division, we did have a mediation program, which I think started under Judge Hollis Webster, if I'm not mistaken, but it never really took off for some reason. It never did. But I used to get the applications for people that wanted to serve as mediators, and they either had to have the 40-hour course or they had to demonstrate the experience, as a retired judge. but those were pretty much the two things that you needed. And then I forget, there were some other things on the application that we looked at. But for whatever reason, that program just it really didn't take off, which is a shame, because it's a good way to resolve disputes. Although I guess in the end, it was good news for me now that I'm in private practice mediation, which I mean, mediation is just, it's an excellent way to resolve disputes. That's been my experience. So ethical standards is important, of course, to be familiar with those. You touched on, I think the big one is the Uniform Mediation Act, which is included. You've included that with the materials. And all these are good handouts and good things to read. And I'd highly recommend that everyone who is going to participate in this program become familiar with these. It's important that you're there with the ethical aspects of mediation.
Thank you, Your Honor. What we have next here on the plate is, this is a 10-minute sample. Oh, I thought I was about to start. A tenant landlord mediation that another bar association recorded as a show us how it works scenario. And Your Honor, I'd like to play this for everybody. It's going to take about 10 minutes. And then on the backside, ask you to, if you would, tell us about your thoughts about how the mediator proceeded and what you think people should take away from it.
Sure.
That work?
Sounds good.
Okay.
It works for me.
The Mediation and Training Collaborative offers mediation services to individuals, families, schools, workplaces, and organizations in Western Massachusetts.
And my apologies for the acting in the first 30 seconds. I didn't have anything to do with that.
In this dramatization of a mediation, Walter, who has rented out an apartment in his house, is having a conflict with his tenant, Marcy. Walter is asking his daughter, Linda, for advice.
You remember when we tried out mediation before? You know, it's really affordable, and I think they do a lot with landlord-tenant issues.
Yeah, Donna suggested that. Maybe I'll try that, Linda. Don't worry about me.
Because this situation involves a potential eviction, the mediation is currently a free service, thanks to state funding. We're going to listen in while Walter and Marcy begin explaining the issues that brought them to mediation.
Let me just remind the two of you that you both agreed not to interrupt the other one. So as we proceed, when you're talking, I'd like you to make a note of anything that comes up for you, but because I certainly want to hear about it, but I don't want you to be interrupting Walter, and Walter, I don't want you to be interrupting Marcy while she's speaking. Okay, Walter, let me begin with you and find out from you what it is that brought you here today.
She's my tenant.
Right?
I didn't want to have a tenant.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter's making rent the little apartment. I didn't want to do it. I thought I was renting to one person. Every weekend, this guy shows up on a motorcycle. He parks it on the grass. On the grass, he parks it. The neighbors are complaining. They make noise. She makes noise at night. That the both of them argue. Sometimes they laugh. Their music, it throbs. It throbs in my head. Boom, 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 boom. I don't know why they can't play good music. It's driving me crazy. I can't. My neighbors are complaining. They don't like the noise. I have a good neighborhood. It's not something, I take it seriously. I try to treat my neighbors right. We've been living together. But listen, this is aggravating me, and something's got to change, or I'm going to evict her. Something's got to change.
All right, so let me see if I've got this straight, Walter. Your concern is that it feels like you have two tenants rather than the one, which was what you
She's got
set
a
out
boyfriend that
to-
comes every weekend.
And then the noise seems to be an issue for you, and
The music and the motorcycle. The
Okay.
music and the motorcycle.
All
Too
right.
loud.
I think I've got that. All right, thank you, Walter. Marcy, would you tell me what the issues are that you're concerned about?
He complains about my boyfriend coming all the time. He never told me you can't have him come over. He complains about the motorcycle. What am I supposed to do about
Next, you'll
that?
have a whole game.
It's his, we're not gonna have a gang. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. You know, I have to work to pay my rent, and now I'm here going through this process, and I can't even be at work right now.
Can I say something?
Just 1 minute. Was there any other?
Well, no, I just
issues that
don't know what you want me to do.
Okay,
I want you use water and electricity like it's free. You take showers 10 times a day. I don't know what you do up there. It's not free. It costs me money. It's more than your rent.
I want to come in here for a moment to say, it sounds as if you are adding another issue. We had identified that the noise was an
Yeah.
important issue, and that the motorcycle and where it was parked was an important issue.
Yeah.
And now you're also talking about the
cost.
water use.
Yes.
Okay.
thank you.
All right.
Well, I know,
Sorry
he's
about
told
that.
me about the water before.
Thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I've added the usage of water and electricity to the list of things to speak with Marcy privately, if you'd make yourself comfortable outside. I understand from what you've said that you don't feel your boyfriend visiting or you're playing music in the evening should be a matter of concern. You also indicated that there was some legal issue for you.
Yeah.
that-
Yeah.
Let me hear what
You
that's
know,
about.
the whole, first of all, I just can't even believe I'm in this mess. I'd like to stay. I don't know if that's possible at this point. I mean, we're just really not getting along. He's really pushing me, saying he's going to evict me. I mean, what am I going to do if he evicts me? And so, you know, he's backing me into a corner. I can get triple damages because he didn't take my security deposit and, you know, put it in whatever that escrow account thing is people always talk about.
And
He
so that's
didn't
a
do what he was
concern for
supposed to
you.
do.
Mhm.
So if he's gonna say he's gonna evict me, then I'm gonna come back at him and tell him we're going to court and he's gonna pay me
Mhm.
triple.
Mhm.
I'm not messing around anymore. I thought it was a good place, but he just isn't really. I don't know. It's like sometimes he doesn't hear me right. I don't know. Maybe it's a hearing issue. Something is different than when I first moved in.
All of these issues have kind of piled up over time.
Okay, I like doing the dishes. You know, I don't want to bother to use the dishwasher, but he doesn't have to just go dumping that in here. I didn't even really know about that. Like he'll say it to me sometimes. How much water do you use? Who pays attention to that? How do you even know?
But your preference, tell me if I'm understanding this right, your preference is to stay in that apartment because you do like it, but
Yeah.
without being concerned that your landlord is unhappy with your tenancy. Is that right?
It's true. It's a really good apartment.
Mhm.
And I mean, he's not the worst landlord in the world.
Well, when the three of us get back together again, would you like me to share with Walter the fact that you really like the apartment and you'd like to figure out a way that would be possible for you to stay there?
Yeah, if it's possible.
Okay. I thank you very much, and I will share with Walter the things that you and I have talked about. And I'm going to ask you now if you would wait outside so that I can have a conversation that's private with Walter.
Sure.
Thank you.
I don't like having a stranger in my house.
Mhm.
My daughters say I should have someone there. They say sometime I'm going to need a caretaker. I don't need a caretaker. I forget some things sometimes, but they said I have to have someone there now, and that I get some money from it, but the money's not worth it. The money's not worth it. She's too loud. You know, you get older. You get older, you can't have what you want anymore. People tell you what to do. I didn't expect this. I don't want to have a stranger in my house who makes me uneasy. I'm
So
nervous.
let me see if I've got what you're feeling about this. Walter, you were initially reluctant to rent out that apartment, but when you met Marcy, you thought, you know, she was a good person and you thought that she would be a good tenant. And over time, your concerns have grown about the noise and the presence of a guest much more frequently than you had imagined.
Yeah.
And that all adds up to your not feeling really peace of mind about having a
My
tenant.
daughter offered to live with me,
Mhm.
and I didn't accept. I thought she should have her own life, but that was a mistake. It's not good to have a stranger. But if I'm going to have a stranger, I just want her to offer a little respect.
Mhm.
You get older and people just tell you what to do. It's not good.
Could you tell me what would be evidence of Marcy respecting you, Walter? I mean, it's a wonderful word, but I want to be sure that it means the same thing to you as it means to me.
She stays up late and makes noise
Right,
with this man that comes there. It's the
so
music.
being quiet after a
Quiet.
certain point at night would be an indication that you're
9:30.
being respected.
9:30.
9:30 sounds like a
Quiet.
good hour to you.
Uh,
Okay. Are there
9:30.
other things that you would like Marcy to be doing that would indicate
He
that she's
shouldn't be there
respected?
every weekend. I didn't rent to him.
All right, so you would like her friend to be there less
I
frequently.
charged her for one person.
Following private sessions, Julie, the mediator, brings Walter and Marcy back together and summarizes their agreements. That the noise level from Marcy's apartment will go down at 9:30 p.m. That Marcy's boyfriend will stay over only on alternate weekends, and they will help with some chores around the property. That Marcy and her boyfriend will be more careful about their water usage, and that Walter will put Marcy's security deposit in an interest-bearing account. Through the process of mediation, Julie has assisted Walter and Marcy in restoring mutual respect and in better understanding how to make their landlord-tenant relationship a more positive one.
That brings us to the end of the video, so I can turn this thing off and we can talk in the real world a little bit. Judge, what'd you think?
I thought it was pretty good. One of the things that struck me the most in critiquing this video, and something that we really didn't talk about, which is very important for a mediator, and I know, Ted, you and I have talked about this during some of our conversations, is the mediator has to be a good listener. And that is really a skill. Learn how to listen to people. It's not so easy. Because as lawyers, I think particularly a lot of us, we want to talk, forget about listening, but it's so critical. I mean, not just in mediations, but in trial work, as you know, as being a trial lawyer, you want to listen to what's going on at all times. So this mediator, to me, demonstrated she was a good listener. She was concerned. She was low key, which I think is also an important characteristic for a successful mediator. And she didn't get loud. She didn't get aggressive. She didn't say, "Oh, what are you worried about 9:30? That's crazy. What do you go to bed at 9:30?" You know, she didn't. I mean, she was very calm, which I think you need to bring that to a mediation, because not everybody is always so calm, including sometimes not the lawyers. So it was a good process. I mean, she did let them talk together. She identified the issues, which I think is not always easy to do, but in that scenario, she was able to identify exactly what the issues were that were bothering them, and then try and formulate solutions to those issues. And I mean, I know it was scripted, and that's great, but that's what mediators do. Let's see. You know, I think she should have asked what he considered good music, though. I was curious. So I don't know. But I thought it was a well done video, and showed a lot of important attributes that mediators should try and emulate.
The one thing I noticed in that video that we hadn't talked about in caucusing was that didn't seem to come up, but when she was doing the caucus, made me realize there are times, I had one not that long ago, where one side is not wanting what they talk to the mediator to be shared with the other side. So you're in a situation as mediator where you're hearing confidential information from the tenant that the landlord never hears and vice versa, right? That happens?
Almost in every mediation, yes.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, and I'm not sure, I'd have to review the opening remarks that I prepared, the suggestions. This may or may not be in there, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed during your opening remarks when you're talking to people. And that is, you may, when we meet separately, want to tell me things that you want to remain in confidence. If you tell me that type of information, you need to let me know that you want it to just remain between us. And you let them know that. So it puts the burden on them to let you know. So during your caucusing, whatever you talk about, unless somebody says, hey, Judge, this is just for your ears. You know, that apartment is loaded with cockroaches or whatever it may be, that, you know, and I've tried to get rid of them. This is the landlord talking. Okay, I've tried to get rid of them. I can't. Haven't been able to do it. Blah blah blah. Of course, that would be an issue. I'm sure the tenant would bring up, but things sometimes are said in confidence. You know, and you just keep it. You just keep it to yourself, or you say, look, if you really expect me to help you resolve this dispute, this may be something that, you know, the landlord needs to know, or this may be something that the tenant needs to know. So while I want to respect your right to that confidentiality of the information, I would encourage you to be a little more forthcoming and give me your permission to pass this along to the other side. That could help us. So things like that. That's what you do. And it varies, but yes, it happens. And one thing, I know this is not the type of mediation, I don't think, where there are going to be submissions from the parties. I mean, in most of the mediations that I do, the attorneys will prepare submissions, and invariably, and that's just, you know, in an injury case, you know, the medical records, the bills, kind of an outline and like an opening statement of what's going on in the case, and most of them are marked confidential or for the mediator's eyes only. And it makes me crazy, especially if you're the plaintiff in the case. If you're the plaintiff in the case, you know, you're looking for the payment of money in an injury case. Why wouldn't you want the other side to know everything there is to know? So I encourage people to exchange their submissions, but if there is something you want to hold back just for the mediator, that's okay too. So I hope that answers that question, Ted.
Oh, it sure does. Thank you. We are coming up on 3:30, and so we need to break soon. But if you've got a few minutes, I don't know if anybody has questions that they have wanted to ask. I see that the panelists that were there before us are still there. David and Judges McCluskey and Belford are still there. Kim's still there. If anybody has any questions before we break, maybe now.
I have a question. Actually, I have a question for Judges McCluskey and Belford. And before I ask my question, I just want to say I picked on Judge McCluskey a little bit, but that's only because I've known him for over 30 years. We've been very good friends. He took me by the hand when I left the state's attorney's office and introduced me to the civil practice of law, and he was great. I had the privilege of officiating his wedding a couple of years ago. So we've been good friends for a long, long time. So I know he knew I was just picking on him just to try and be funny. But here's my question for Judge McCluskey and Judge Belford. When you've handled the eviction call, have you had pretrial conferences with people, or do you just leave this up to Prairie State and the other side, which is the way it used to be when I had the call, because it was a busy call. I mean, it was a pretty busy call, so we didn't have time for pretrials, but I'm wondering if you've conducted pretrials during your tenure in those courts. Jim, what about you? You've been there longer than Craig.
Yeah, it's boy, it's closing on more than 2.5 years now in eviction court. I do some informal type of pretrial conferences instead of conducting a formal trial. I pose some questions to the landlord, to the tenant, you know, and I do things like you had discussed in this mediation training. And, you know, I tell them about, you know, your chance of collecting all the amount you're asking to collect is, it can be remote. I'm going to hear your case and I'll rule on your case. But if you want an early possession date, maybe you want to compromise on what you're claiming. It really is most helpful if the landlord has an attorney. But I talk to the pro se's all the time, so I don't like, okay, swear them in, put them up on the stand. If I have to do it, I have to do it. But I conduct a lot of discussions with them to see if I can settle the case, even on the return date. And sometimes Prairie State doesn't have the ability to hear all these type of cases on an informal basis, because before pre-COVID, they only had one attorney in the courtroom. Now they have 3 attorneys in the courtroom. They have to go through this vetting process, this conflict process. Takes a lot of time. If I can get them when they step up in front of me, you know, sometimes I get it done in 5 minutes. But it is basically telling them, look, the tenant's always worried about not being able to rent some premises in the future because they have a record of an eviction. If I can convince the landlord to seal the record, and it is in the best interest to have them move out, and the tenant will say, okay. And I say, when can you leave? Okay, what is your plan to leave? Because you know it's going to happen if you don't pay the rent. And so I have some discussions with them about that. And I would say I'm pretty successful at something like that. So I do have an informal pretrial conference. I don't, you know, ask them to come back in chambers. I do it right on the bench. And the other tenants see how I conduct myself. Okay.
When we were still live in the courthouse, Judge, David Clark had the Ask a Lawyer program on Thursdays, once or twice a month for a few years. And I volunteered with him on that program. And Judge McCluskey dragged me out. I had somebody come down to get me from his staff. I don't remember who it was, and said, I need one of you guys to come over. David had a client he was working with. There are a lot like the ones in the video. Judge McCluskey, I come down, says, can you help these people out? He has somebody from Prairie State representing the tenant, and I've got the landlord, has us go out in the hall to talk things out and work it out. It was the son evicting his parents. Mom and dad were being put out in the street, and we had to work things out. And McCluskey's like, well, you know, you guys can facilitate this with them, can't you? It took some doing, but this man's creative. We had to figure out logistics about what they were going to do with family heirlooms and what was going to happen with grandkids coming to visit. But we got there. Every creative Thursday that man could come up with, he did.
Well, I think Judge Souter and you know, Ted, your presentation was excellent. I want to say this. I was very impressed. But the one thing you're absolutely right about, both of you, is you have to be a good listener. And, you know, I practiced law for 39 years, and I was always concerned about what I was going to say and advocating for my client. But now that being on the bench a little over 3 years now, I have to do a lot of listening and not interrupting. And that was a skill that I had to learn as being on the bench. You have to listen, and then you wait for an opening, and then you make a suggestion. But I will say that, you know, I remember that case. That was the case where the Romanians, I call them, I think they were, but we had a language problem. Okay, we had language difficulty, but we also had, you could tell, because there was in-laws that were involved in that case, and it was a lot of emotions involved. And you have to recognize that when you're sitting on the bench, that especially in these eviction cases, it's a very, very sad court. And there's a lot of emotions involved in this. And you have to be able to allow people to say what they need to say. And then you say, okay, we have to come to a solution here. And, you know, if you work on them and you have patience, you could be, it's surprising how you can get the result that you really want to get, and the goal you're looking for. So, yeah, but I think this mediation program is going to be very successful. It's going to be very helpful for the court system. And I think it's going to be enriching for the people who want to be involved in it. So thank you.
We have a question from Don Nathan.
I was just going to follow up real
Oh,
quick.
sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to follow up on Jim's observation real quick. I try to do something similar when I have the parties before me. Again, nothing in the nature of a formal pretrial conference, but the first thing I try to do is ascertain, particularly on the tenant side, what they're looking for. Are they looking to move out, or are they wanting to stay? Because I think that kind of frames the conversation at that point, and prior conversations sometimes haven't been had. So I think the tenant doesn't know there are potential options on the table. I think they arrive in court just thinking, I'm getting kicked out and I'm going to have a judgment entered against me. So I will ask them, what is it you're wanting to do? Are you hoping to stay in the apartment, or do you just want to move out? And depending on the answer to that question, then a conversation can start with the landlord, typically the landlord's attorney, about what options are available then, short of this going to trial and a judgment being entered. If they want to move out, often the landlord is very accommodating, willing to waive the money claim, as long as they're willing to commit to a move out date. If they want to stay, then we maybe start talking about payment plans, which again is an option they may not have known about. They just thought it was all or nothing. So that's the first thing I try to do at the front end, is just identify what are the parties' goals. And if the goals, because oftentimes, again, like I said, I think they think it's often black or white, and that there are options that are gray. So then we can have a conversation from the bench about what some of that gray might look like. And I think it's a surprise to some of the tenants that they have options other than just being kicked out.
We've had a question from Don Nathan. He's asked a couple of times now, so I'm going to try to sneak it in here for the judges. He wants to know about the availability for jury trials for eviction cases. Judge Souter and I do a completely different presentation on that topic, but it's
So what is the question specifically? Just is it an option?
How do you handle it if jury demand's made? How does it work? How does it go through the system?
Well, jury demand has to be made on the first return date. If it's made after that, there is no right to a jury trial, which means that in most cases, we're not looking at jury trials. You have to have a fairly savvy, sophisticated, represented, or lucky tenant to get their jury demand in timely, because it does have to be on the first return. That window is very small in terms of a right to a jury trial. I have yet to have a timely filed jury demand in any of my cases. I've had fewer, and I've been doing it less time than Judge McCluskey. I'm sure you've had a few.
I've had jury demands, but then when I impose pretrial orders that they have to file certain motions in limine, they have to file jury instructions, and I give a time limit on that. Otherwise, in the order, it says you waive your jury demand. So they never really comply. But most of the time, it's what Judge Belford had to say. It's a case out of Cook County, and it's been, it went to the appellate court in Cook County. I think there's a second case, and it's another case out of Cook County. But if you do not file that jury demand at the time of the return date, the initial return date, you waive your jury demand. And that always, well, that occurs 99.9% of the time. So the opportunity for a jury demand is very, very, very minute in eviction court.
Judge Souter, did you ever see a jury when you had that call?
No, I did not. I did not. I don't even recall jury demands being filed. I mean, I had the call for about 10 months, as I recall. So we had a lot of bench trials.
That's for sure.
So Don Nathan, we look forward to you being the first.
Yeah, do not construe this as a challenge.
What about you, Dave Clark? Have you had any experience with juries and eviction cases?
We did have one, as someone put it, a savvy pro se litigant. He demanded it. And then once the judge that was sitting at the time, probably 15 years ago, said, okay, well, great, I'll expect your jury instructions and everything. Then he quickly changed course and decided, after all, bench trial would be best. And so that was what happened. you know.
All right, well, I think this great program that you all are putting on now will eliminate the need for any jury trials and hopefully most bench trials in the future. I think it's going to be a very successful program, and I'm happy to see it coming together in the way that it has. It's going to be good for everybody.
I think so too.
Great.
So I want to thank all of our, unless we have any other questions. Doesn't look like.
Aren't any in the box.
So I want to thank our Judge McCluskey, Judge Belford, Judge Souter, David and Ted for your presentations in this first half of our program today.